Thanks, Professor Eric. It's time for our next talk. So I would like to introduce Professor Matthew McCabe. He's a professor in the Environmental Science and Engineering at King Abdullah University of Science and Technologies. And the title of his presentation is Semi-Autonomous Systems Enable Advances in Earth Observation. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thanks very much for that. And it's a pleasure to be here, but I'm going to start off with a confession. I'm neither a roboticist nor an autonomy specialist. I'm a technologist, if there's any description that exists on that. Basically, we try and use and exploit the advances in the technology that people in this room are developing for a variety of applications. And I could give a whole talk on the Earth observation and the environmental sensing approaches that we use, but given the session, I'm going to focus in on some of the work that we do within the agricultural sector. And this is really drawing from, or obviously drawing from the work within my team. There's a few members of the audience in the audience here. I'll divert any hard questions to them, but I'll get Omar and Dario and Victor to introduce themselves at the end of the talk, because they're really driving some of the work that we're doing on the ground-based robotics, but also some of the new CubeSat-based satellite retrievals that we're just recently launched here at KAUST. And I introduced the satellite aspect because my interest is really on the combination of all of these platforms to give improved insight into Earth system processes. And while I said I could talk about many different processes from the Earth environmental sciences, I'm going to focus on the agricultural sector. That's an area that we've spent quite a bit of time on. I've just got a little thing popping up here. And if this hasn't already been said, the agricultural sector is obviously pretty important globally, but also regionally and nationally. And there's many big problems in there that we need to address when we think about the coming century and the pressures that are on particularly our food and water systems as a consequence of the consumption habits that we perform on a daily basis. Growing populations, climate change, freshwater insecurity, all of these have a root relation back to the insecurity of our food and water supplies. So agriculture employs 1.3 billion people. It's a $2.4 trillion industry. So it has a massive global imprint, particularly in developing countries where we talk about the percentage of the population involved in this industry. Some of our neighboring regions, there's 50, 60, 70% of the population are indirectly involved in agriculture. So it's an incredibly important sector. Now, from a climate perspective, heard my introduction. I'm a professor of remote sensing and water security. I'm also director of the Climate Livability Initiative here at KAUST. Agriculture really has an imprint in that sector as well. It's the #1 contributor to landfill. About a third of the food that we eat is wasted. All right. It's the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases. It's the #1 water user. So my background is in hydrology, civil environmental engineering. It's how we understand water movement through the Earth system. So focusing in on agriculture makes a lot of sense. Now, the goal of this work, a lot of the work that we do within my team, is really trying to optimize our food and water systems, because small improvements in efficiency translate to big improvements in volumes, particularly when you're talking about 70% of fresh water being used towards production of our food systems. In Saudi Arabia, that number is more like 85%. And you can imagine the sustainability of that practice when we don't have a lot of rainfall and the water is coming principally from groundwater reserves. Now, it's an area that's still very much in the dark ages. We talk about an industry ripe for disruption. Well, the agriculture sector is certainly one of those. But it's one that's becoming increasingly data rich. It's information poor, but data rich. And that data is really being delivered and driven by some of the technological advances I'm going to talk about today. Not just satellites, but UAVs and increasingly ground-based robotics. And one of the themes I'm going to refer to, I know Eric had indicated for people like me, the non-technologists or the non-roboticists, to challenge the audience, is how do we turn that data into information? How do we turn it into decisions? All right, because I'm really at the front end of the users of this application, the farmers. How can they take the technology that's very much available today off the shelf and translate it and utilize it to improve the efficiency of the systems that they operate? So within my group, we are technology agnostic. And by that, I mean, we will take anything that gives us information or insights into the environment that we're working in. All right, so we are using UAVs. We're recently been using ground-based robotics. We've even partnered with collaborators here at KAUST in exploiting insects. This is red palm weevil. I don't know if Atif is in the audience, but if he's not, maybe you can talk to Atif Shamim about some of the augmentation of insects to provide more information on their patterns of behavior. We're very much interested in emerging systems as well. Now, 10 years ago, UAVs were an emerging system, but there's been 10 years of development in the UAV, so it's quite a mature technology in that regard. But we talk about things like HAPS, the high altitude pseudo satellites, nanosatellites, CubeSats. These really weren't on the horizon 10 years ago, and in some cases 5 years ago, even more recently, drone swarms. How can we start leveraging the technology that's being developed by you and others to provide the information that we're interested in to get to that third panel, turning the data that they collect into decisions? So I'm going to give a few examples of where we are trying to develop that pathway. And as I said, one of the big focus areas is here on using technology to deliver what we call agricultural informatics, information on the system that can be used to either manage or improve the operation. And as I said, for something that's such an important part of human development, it's central to human development, the agricultural systems, we know very little about its performance, even in the most developed countries. If you're trying to predict yield in advance or estimate crop production in a particular season, even in the US, you don't get that information in real time. You don't even get it in near real time. You usually get it after this harvest time. All right, so that doesn't help you in planning or forecasting things like drought or food insecurity. And we've seen some very real examples of that in the last few years with the disruption that COVID has played in the international logistics and food supply markets, and the rise in prices that you see, or the consequent rise in prices that you see because of that uncertainty. Now, it's obviously very important in Saudi Arabia, and I have a little graphic down there in the bottom right, which shows a basically 20-year progression of agricultural activity in the kingdom, from nothing through to a system that supports a relatively small amount of the food that's produced within the region, but consumes a huge volume of water. All right, so when you look at efficiency of production, this is not a great example of that. So what we're interested to do is find out what's happening in these fields and whether we can make 5, 10, 20% improvements on the efficiency of their operation, potentially how they're using water, or how they're overusing water, unsustainably using water. Because if we make those improvements, and to put it into context, Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest producers of desalinated water in the world. All right, produce around 2 to 3 billion cubic meters of water a year. Agriculture uses 10 times that. All right. And the amount of oil, about 20% of Saudi incomes goes to produce desalinated water. It's a huge number. All right, barrel of oil is $80 a day. You got a million barrels of oil being used to produce water. You can do the sums over a year. Groundwater is free. And that's the big problem with it. We don't value it. You know, the biggest cost to the farmer in using water is the diesel to pump to get it up to the ground. So there's big efficiency gains that we can make and improve the sustainability of these operations, or at least prolong them, because this does add a food security buffer. Now, I mentioned before about our interest in satellites, and for the longest time, what I see on the left here, this is a MODIS satellite. Some of you may be familiar with it. This has been around for about 25 or more years. This was the best we could hope for. It was daily retrieval with a very coarse resolution. So you always had to make a compromise. There were other systems that gave you high resolution, but infrequent in time, every 2 weeks. So if you're trying to manage the operation of a farm system, you can't use that information to any great extent. Well, within the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen a real revolution in Earth observation, driven in part by 2 technologies. The first being CubeSats, which is offering these small shoebox-sized modularized platforms that you can get very high resolution information. And it's not just one satellite, really upended the approach to launching Earth observations. They don't launch one at $1 billion, which is what MODIS is. They launch 100 at a fraction of that cost. And so suddenly you bridge that temporal gap. You can get high resolution information at the daily scale. And that really changes the equation in terms of the information you can now extract on food and agricultural development activity. The other big development has been in UAVs. And this is all pretty much over the same field. And you can see the dramatic resolution in enhancements that you get going from MODIS at 1 kilometer to CubeSat at 3 meters and daily to a UAV at 3 centimeters whenever you want. So we're really interested in trying to combine these technologies, the ground-based robotic systems, the airborne UAVs, and the satellite remote sensing. because one of the big drawbacks, I guess, of UAVs and robotic systems is that they operate at relatively small scales. But commercial agriculture is very large scale. It's national scale, it's international scale. So you need to provide a nested approach of observation to manage all of these systems locally through to the global scale. And in the last 10 years, we've developed a pretty comprehensive collection of UAV systems, but also the sensors that we put on them to help us derive information on the various processes we're looking at, in this case, agricultural systems. So the technology spread that you see here is about 10 years old, from some very early DJI type crafts, even before that building our own, which were a disaster for the most part. DJI had really revolutionized UAV operation and the collection of information, through to some of the fixed wing supplies. And we could go into the various benefits and disadvantages of both of those. But it's really this ability of these technologies to act as a hook in the sky. Basically, we can put any sensor we want to a large degree on board these systems and collect information which tells us something about the system of interest. So we span the spectrum from using optical cameras through to thermal, multi-spectral, and even hyperspectral, and most recently LiDAR data. And it's a combination of this information that we're most interested in. Any one variable is going to tell you something, multi-variables tell you much more, obviously. And the things that we try and extract, the variables of interest and the scales of interest, move from the laboratory through to the field, through to commercial farm scale. Commercial farm scale is a single field, might be 50 hectares, but within Saudi Arabia, you have about 30,000 of those 50 hectare fields. All right, and we want to manage all of them. We don't want to manage one in really, really great detail. We want to manage all of them. So that's why we have to develop this nested approach. So we want to go from regional, national, and then obviously to global. If we can do it here, then we can translate that to do it everywhere. And the things that we try and extract are obviously water use. We are also interested in the phenology of the crop, because understanding how the crop grows through time gives you an indication of the yield ahead of time. So by combining real-time information and real-time data collection, you can forecast what the yield might be. And having that information is an incredible resource for food security. Being able to determine whether your crops are going to be above or below production helps you project forward market needs, whether you need to go to some other country to get your wheat for that year, whether you can forecast, whether through a climate model or some other approach, the predominant weather conditions that are going to affect the crops. Having this information helps drive a decision support system. And that's really where we're trying to seek and derive this information and channel it into these types of decision support system frameworks. Now, to give you an example, as I said, when I first started this work, we were operating at the global scale, or the smaller scale would have been the field. Now, I've been at KAUST about 10 years, and we're a small university, so it fosters this capacity to develop collaborations with people we otherwise wouldn't meet. And one of the greatest, most interesting collaborations I've made is with the plant physiologists, plant biologists, and geneticists within the Centre for Desert Agriculture, where they see the advantage of moving from the lab scale through to the field scale to test their various accessions of different crop types. Here we're looking at probably a couple of hundred different accessions of quinoa in a field trial, where we use UAV data to help us understand which ones are performing better or not in the local conditions. So we develop the methodologies and the frameworks to extract the information that tells you out of the hundreds of different accessions under these different salinity trials or conditions or nutrient applications, which is performing well. And we do that using UAVs and these different sensors, as well as some data analytics to help them undertake the sort of genetic assessment of these different crop types. But it's really the combination of hyperspectral, optical, and thermal data that drives that type of information. Now, that's very small scale for me. For us, it's big scale for them, from the lab bench through to a field. But that's really the smallest scale that we operate, because we are then leveraging technologies that can help you inform at the leaf scale. But what we're really interested in is this commercial scale, these 50 hectare farms, and the 30,000 or so of those that are operating in the kingdom. And for that, you need to deploy both UAV systems, but also satellite data. And that's where I want to give the example of this combination of these various platforms to help inform, in this case, on water uptake. Again, trying to understand the efficiency and the operation of these systems, because that then goes into helping you choose the types of crops that you are going to grow, whether you can get less efficient crops from other locations and focus on the types of crops that are best suited to the environment that you're growing it in. as a sort of example of moving beyond agriculture, but kind of related to agriculture, one of the big activities in the kingdom is this whole restoration, regeneration of green areas within Saudi Arabia. There's a huge Saudi Green Initiative. One of the aspects of that you may have heard is the planting of lots of trees. Well, we're interested in some of the tree planting activities for sure, but we're also interested in the mangrove activities. Now, mangroves, you'll see on the coastline here, they have a much greater potential for carbon storage, and they are also obviously resistant to low water quality. They grow in the ocean, all right? So they don't need fresh water to grow. So this is an activity that we're exploring, and how we again use ground-based sensors, airborne systems, and satellite remote sensing to help us understand, in this case, carbon accounting, carbon assimilation. That's a big area in terrestrial ecosystem dynamics, trying to understand the carbon storage potential of some of these new developments, these restoration, regeneration, revegetation activities. And that's really an application area, great growth application area for technology to be directed towards. So we've talked a little bit about UAVs, and I'm going to cycle back to some of that. In some of the more recent work that we've done, this is being led by Omar, who I'm sure, Omar, you have a poster today or yesterday. Anyway, he'll talk a little bit more about the Boston Dynamics Spot robot that we employed to help us understand, in this case, a little bit of the tree structural properties. Now, the reason for doing this is because UAVs have a limitation. UAVs are great for crops, but if you're doing tree crops or orchard crops, they're also great, but they can only see from above onto the top of the canopy. And most of the fruit is growing underneath the canopy. Or if you want to understand the dynamics of phenology, a quick growing crop, for instance, you want to be under that canopy to help try and understand and map those dynamics. So that's where you need the ground-based robotic systems, or at least you need a combination of those. So we've equipped Spot with a LiDAR, and we're looking at ways to optimize the collection of that information so we can retrieve, the phenology, the tree structural properties, and other variables of interest that we might want to extract from orchards in an operational context, but combining them with UAVs. And this is one of the big gaps that we see or we're struggling with. It may not be a gap at all, maybe have a simple solution, but given that I'm not in the field, perhaps you can help me. We want to combine these data sources, not just post-processing, that's simple to do. We want to do it in near real time or close to real time. We want to be able to fly a UAV over a large area and identify the specific problem location or the hotspots within a field, and then be able to send a robot in there. So there needs to be two-way communication. But we also want to be able to provide information, data in real time to the farmer to operate on. So that requires analysis that would normally be performed back at the desktop on board. So it's the onboard processing, it's the communication, it's the interaction between these two different robotic systems, which often have proprietary information or proprietary controls on them in the first place. It makes it even more challenging. But that's the application, that's the end goal. And as I'm going to explain a little bit, I'm going to skip through this in the interest of time. This is kind of the example that we're seeing, and this was the limitation I showed before. On the left, you see the UAV-based point cloud, gives you a lot of nice information from above, but doesn't tell you what's happening below. A different tree using the ground-based LiDAR, you can actually see the real tree structural properties. You can start to extract information. Well, what we want to do, obviously, is combine those point clouds, get the best of both platforms. That's really the goal here, trying to maximize the information content from these different systems. And what I'm referring to in the previous slide is that technology is not the constraint of science, at least the work that we're doing. The technology largely exists. Oh, the UAV is very mature, the ground-based robotics, incredible. Now we're looking at swarm robotics, and one of the biggest challenges for flying UAVs for us, this is a nightmare scenario, is what's being demonstrated in this recent video. So they can go through very complex, tight environments, and managed commercial farms aren't as bad as this, but they can navigate. This is the first big challenge, navigating through complex environments. Well, we want to take the next step then, is how do we then put sensors of interest on there, on UAVs that we can actually fly for periods of time. I imagine these probably have a 5-minute battery life. They certainly can't carry the sensors that we're after, and they probably can't communicate and transmit to other larger platforms, and power requirements aren't there. So this is one of the big gaps. But, I saw this video a month or two ago, and it was just, pretty incredible. So this is why technology is not the constraint to science. In so many fields of science, You know, you want to be able to do something, but the technology doesn't exist yet to do it. In my field, it's fantastic. You know, you guys are delivering the technology. We're looking for the use cases, and we're not constrained by what's available out there. It's just, for me, the next iteration of what exists, and that's the exciting element of it. So in the last few slides, I just want to give you a few examples. Some of these may be obvious. Some of them are mature than others, but it's the combination of the platform with the analytics that's the real exciting area here. And this is really combining machine vision and machine learning approaches. This is not my example. These are some examples of common applications. But what we're not seeing yet is the application of these at scale. All right, so when you're operating commercial size farms, you know, the technology is fantastic, but how well is it going to scale to 50 hectares or 10,000 hectares of all the fields? You know, this is something that requires a considerable leap in activity. You know, tree species identification, being able to have these robotic systems autonomously fly and identify. We want to look at wildlife tracking and monitoring. All right, the technology is there to do this. You know, the communication protocols and analysis framework is there to do this, but it's overcoming some of the very boring power constraints, the range constraints, the data handling constraints that are limiting the applications for our purposes. This was the example I sort of wanted to highlight before, the combination of approaches. You know, you can't fly UAVs everywhere. Satellites see the whole world. And as I said, we just launched a recent satellite from KAUST a few weeks ago, something that you couldn't really have done, at least to the type of technology that we've put on that satellite a few years ago. But the evolution of CubeSats, the reusable rockets of Elon Musk, et cetera, you know, this is really the future of Earth observation. But how do we leverage those globe-seeing platforms with UAVs and with robotics to help in this particular problem? Identifying areas, identifying hotspots of issue that a farmer can then go and respond to. And our previous talk talked about the wireless communication, LoRa communication at range. Well, this is something that UAVs can obviously handle, but so can HAPS and balloons, these high altitude pseudo satellites, providing platforms or communication platforms for seamless transmission of information between these various platforms. All right, so this is kind of overviewing where we're at. The technology and science is incredible. It's super exciting. That's why you know, it's a fantastic time to be a professor and run a research group. There's amazing tools, there's amazing applications, but we can't get lost in the fact that that doesn't equal impact or translation. And if I'm thinking of this guy at the bottom right, who's trying to make decisions at the farm, there's a huge road to travel before he takes what's existing here and applies it at the field scale. So this is something that hopefully, you know, I'm probably going to end on this, but we can be mindful of, is how do we translate that technology to useful application? And as I said, I've just really talked about one narrow aspect of the agricultural sector. We could translate this across various environmental and earth system science problems, but it's how we can translate the data the information and data we collect, the analysis that we can need to do in real time. It's no point having this information 3 months after the fact. You know, we need to be able to collect the data, analyze the data, provide a decision in the support system for a person to operate and manage. So what are the pain points and gaps? Well, I think I've highlighted some of those. Power obviously is a big one. You know, the most I can fly is about 45 minutes. All right, and that's with a light payload. A robot's the same thing, about 45 minutes. And that moves at, you know, 5 kilometers an hour. So you just can't scale that activity. So how we get around it is leverage the platforms, you know, leverage these different nested approaches to observations, optimize where we collect the data, but that doesn't get around the real-time decision support system. All right. I'm going to leave it there. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to address them. As I said, the hard questions, I'll defer to my students at the back of the room. Thanks, everyone.